In Washington, a city of contrasts, where wealth gleamed in gleaming skyscrapers and poverty lurked in dark alleys, Richard was a prominent figure. His presence was like a beacon among the business elite. His name echoed in all social circles as a synonym for success as well as power. Newspapers hailed him as a mining magnate, and his achievements were the topic of conversation at gala dinners and charity events held in the city, being hailed even by local politicians who insisted on linking his name to theirs. However, as much as his fortune put him on a pedestal, there was a pain that money could not heal. A pain that for some time tormented Richard day and night, devouring his soul with sharp claws. Her daughter, Emily, had been in a coma for 6 long months, and there was no amount of money in the world that could cure her. Richard devoted much of his busy day to visiting Emily in the hospital, his heart heavy with anguish and despair. He watched helplessly as she stood motionless, trapped in a state between life and death. His closed eyes seemed to hide secrets he longed to unravel, his silent breathing a constant reminder of his frailty. Every beat of Richard's heart echoed Emily's name, a silent prayer for her to awaken from this deep sleep. But even with the best doctors in charge of doing something for her were not being able, her caregivers also did not see the slightest sign that that young girl was going to return. After each new meeting, each new deal done, Richard drove to the hospital as fast as he could, and when he reached his daughter's room, he held her hand gently, feeling the coldness of her skin against his. His tears fell silently, like lonely drops in a sea of sadness. A man of his position should not be seen showing weakness, much less crying. And he wondered, in despair, if he would ever hear his daughter's sweet voice again, or if he would be doomed to live in the darkness of her absence forever. In the not-so-distant past, Emily was a young girl full of life and energy, a free soul who flew high through the green fields of childhood. She grew up surrounded by the love and affection of her parents, Richard and Elizabeth, in a stately mansion on the outskirts of the city. From an early age, Emily demonstrated a natural talent for sports, and her love of adventure led her a year ago to start exploring the snow-capped mountains of the Swiss Alps. Almost instantly, skiing became her passion, a source of joy and freedom she couldn't find anywhere else. Perhaps a way to escape his rich but ruled life. At that time, she was already 16 years old, and it was on one of these escapes to the mountains that cruel fate cast its shadow on Emily's life. On a sunny winter day, while skiing on the snowy slopes, a terrible accident left her on the verge of death. A brutal fall, an uncontrolled spin, and the sound of breaking bones echoing in the silent mountains. When Richard received the call from the hospital, his world seemed to completely collapse around him. The heart beat frantically in his chest. He flew close to his daughter, finding her lying on the hospital bed, pale and motionless like a broken doll. Doctors explained that Emily had suffered a severe head trauma and that her chances of recovery were still uncertain, and they couldn't confirm to him if he would at least have his daughter back. Richard took her back to the United States, where he began to follow her more closely, but his heart was completely broken by the pain of seeing her like this. He wondered over and over again what he could have done to avoid this cruel fate, if there was something he could have changed to protect his daughter from the danger lurking on the mountain slopes. But it was too late, and in those last 6 months he was beginning to come across the fact that there were many things that money could never buy. And so, while Emily lay in her deep sleep, trapped in a state between life and death, Richard faced his own demons, struggling with the guilt and remorse that consumed him day after day, being tormented by that melancholy outcome in his daughter's life. The tragedy that befell Emily was not only physical, but also emotional. Years earlier, the loss of her mother, Elizabeth, 5 years before the accident, left a deep wound in the heart of Emily and her father, Richard. Elizabeth was the mainstay of the family, a warm and loving presence who radiated light and joy into every corner of the mansion. It was she who managed to control Richard's impulses and veracity for business, and managed to some extent keep him under the reins and with attention on his daughter. But after Elizabeth left this world prematurely, Richard and Emily find themselves caught in a whirlwind of pain and despair. Richard, as expected, immersed himself even more in his work, drowning his pain in endless meetings and business negotiations. And that somehow worked well, because in those last years he had increased his fortune as never before. However, outside of business he closed himself emotionally, building walls around his heart to protect him from the unbearable pain of loss. And that was terrible, because her daughter, entering adolescence, needed strong references more than ever, and now there was no one else by her side. In this way, Emily felt abandoned and lost after her mother's departure. She watched her father distance himself more and more from her, plunging into his own darkness as she struggled to find a way to fill the void left by her mother's absence. The relationship between father and daughter has become tense and extremely fragile, with unspoken words and unexpressed feelings hovering in the air between them. There were dozens of recurring episodes that made the girl move away more and more every day. The last straw was when on her 15th birthday, her father did not even remember to congratulate her. Richard, when he realized it a week later, was embarrassed and tried to redo the mistake by buying airline tickets for a trip to Switzerland. It was there, by the irony of fate, that she met the skiing that would lead to the accident a little over a year later. She did not forgive him for forgetting, but thanked him for introducing her to that sport. The accident that left Emily in a coma seemed to serve to deepen once and for all the abyss that years before had opened between them. Richard blamed himself for not being able to protect his daughter, while Emily fought for life in her hospital bed. Father and daughter faced their own internal battles, separated by an emotional distance that seemed increasingly difficult to overcome. A few years earlier, when Emily was still facing the pain of grief, in the luxurious living room of the Davis mansion, Richard was sitting in his leather armchair, absent-mindedly flipping through financial reports at his mahogany desk. When Emily entered the room, her shoulders hunched and her eyes tired. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Richard looked up from the papers, an expression of impatience crossing his face. "What is it, Emily?" "I'm busy right now." The girl hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the couch in front of him, her eyes red with tiredness and sadness. "I know you're busy, but I need to talk to you. It's about Mom." Richard sighed heavily, a shadow of sadness passing through his eyes. "What do you want to know about her, Emily?" "She's gone. There's nothing we can do to bring her back." "I know, Dad, but I miss her. I miss your laughter, your stories, your smell. Don't you miss her too?" Richard lowered his gaze, the pain in his heart as visible as in Emily's eyes. "Of course I miss her, Emily, but we need to move on. I have an empire to take care of, and you need to focus on your studies and your future." "But what about us, Dad? What happened to our family?" Richard stood up abruptly, his eyes hardened with determination. "Our family is still here, Emily, but we need to be strong. We need to overcome this pain together. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have urgent business to attend to." Richard left the room in a hurry, afraid to confront what was before his very eyes, leaving Emily alone with her pain and her loneliness. She looked at the closed door sadly, wondering if she could ever find a way to reconnect with her father. As Richard walked through the busy streets towards the hospital, a breath of cold wind cut his face, bringing with it the promise of a frosty day. His wool coat was no match for the cold that penetrated his bones, but he was barely aware of the temperature as his thoughts swirled around Emily. However, even in his frantic race to get to his daughter's side, something made him suddenly stop. A soft, barely perceptible voice caught his attention. Richard turned and saw a beggar woman, sitting in a corner of the sidewalk, her eyes fixed on him. "Good morning, sir." Richard ignored her, as he always did, his mind taken by concern for his daughter. He took a few steps forward, completely ignoring the beggar. "Please, sir, anything helps." But Richard continued his ruthless path, not looking back. He had no time to deal with strangers begging on the street. His thoughts were totally absorbed by Emily and the battle she was waging for life in the hospital. He could not afford to be distracted by the difficulties of others when his own daughter was fighting for life. With a heavy sigh, he continued on his way towards the hospital, determined to get to Emily's side as soon as possible. In the following days, Richard found the same beggar woman in the same place, asking for help. He passed her with an indifferent look, his mind consumed by his own troubles and afflictions. But on the third day, when he passed the beggar again, she called him by name. Surprised, Richard stopped and looked at her, his expression of surprise turning to disbelief. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice echoing with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "I only know what I know," she replied. "You seem worried. Can I help in any way?" Richard frowned, surprised by the unexpected offer of help from a stranger and even worse, from a homeless woman, what she would have to help him.
"No, me."
"I'm doing okay," grunted, annoyed at the inconvenience, still trying to understand how she knew his name. The beggar smiled softly, her eyes shining with an inner light that seemed to illuminate the dark street. "I know about your daughter, Richard, and I know you're suffering a lot for her." Richard was surprised to hear those words. He had never seen this beggar before in his life, so how could she know about his personal situation? "How do you know about my daughter?" The beggar bowed her head, her smile widening. "I have my ways, sir, and I know you need help." Richard was shocked to hear her words. He had never seen this beggar before in his life, so how could she know about his personal situation? Intrigued, he approached her, his mind full of questions. For a moment he felt afraid. Maybe they were leaking data from the hospital, but there was something very wrong there. The beggar then smiled, telling him not to worry, and he explained to her that she possessed the gift of intuition, the ability to feel and understand the emotions of others. She saw Richard's pain and the anguish he carried for his daughter, and she wanted to help him. Richard laughed dismissively at that and made mention if he went his way. "I've never heard so much bullshit," I said angrily as I followed. "Sir, please wait a moment." Richard stopped again, annoyed by the new interruption, but curious at the beggar's insistence. "What is it now? I know you're worried about your daughter, but she needs you more than ever right now." Richard looks at the beggar, surprised by her meddling in personal affairs. "Who are you to give me advice about my daughter? And know that I am going right there, and I can feel the pain you carry in your heart. Your daughter is trying to communicate with you, even in her comatose state." Richard is even more surprised by the beggar's words, his mind spinning with a mixture of emotions. Is it some kind of joke? "Don't talk about my daughter again. I don't want to offend you, let alone annoy you. I understand that it is hard to believe, but sometimes the bonds between parents and children are stronger than we can imagine. Your daughter is struggling, and she needs to feel your presence next to her." Richard continued to stare at the beggar for a moment, his thoughts tumultuous with her words. "What do you mean? She's trying to communicate with me. Your daughter may be in a coma, but her soul is still there. She may not be able to speak to you in words, but her heart is crying out for your presence. She wants you whole, body and soul." Richard was silent for a moment, absorbing the beggar's words, feeling a little confused, and went out saying, "Well, I have to go. I don't have time for that right now." Richard turned away from the beggar, his mind spinning with new thoughts and possibilities. He wasn't sure if he believed anything in her words, but something inside him makes him want to believe that there was hope for his daughter. He turned his back on the beggar and continued his hurried way towards the hospital. His heart was heavy with concern for his daughter, Emily, and he couldn't afford to be distracted by strangers on the street. Arriving at the hospital, Richard was promptly met by a concerned nurse. "Mr. Davis, I was waiting for you to arrive. There's something we need to discuss about your daughter." Richard felt a lump form in his throat as the nurse led him to Emily's room. Her heart was beating fast, fearing the worst. "Emily's condition has worsened since you were last here. Her vital signs are unstable and doctors are doing their best to stabilize her." But the nurse's words were momentarily lost in a blur as Richard entered Emily's room and saw his daughter still lying on the bed, motionless, pale and fragile as a porcelain doll. He approached the bed, holding her hand tenderly. "Emily, my dear, I am here. Please fight. I can't lose you." Tears rolled almost unbridled down Richard's face as he silently begged for a miracle. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to cry in front of someone else. Many years earlier, before work almost completely occupied her mind and became an obsession, even during Emily's childhood, Richard and his daughter shared precious moments that would become cherished memories for a lifetime. From Emily's uncertain first steps to adventures together at the park, father and daughter have built a strong and lasting connection. It was a sunny Sunday morning. Richard took little Emily to the park to play. As he pushed the swing, Emily laughed out loud, her golden curls flying in the wind. With each thrust of the swing, her infectious laugh filled the air, filling Richard's heart with joy. "Go higher, Dad!" Emily screamed, her eyes shining with emotion. Richard smiled and pushed harder, feeling happy to share that simple but special moment with his daughter. He knew that these moments were precious and that even when life took them on different paths, the memories of their time together would always hold them together. In the afternoon, they ventured on a treasure hunt through the backyard of the huge house in which they lived. Richard hid small treasures, while Emily followed in his wake, with a makeshift map in her hands. Each discovery was greeted with cries of excitement and infectious laughter. "Dad, look what I found!"
Émilie exclaimed, clutching a treasure, a butterfly pendant.
Richard smiled, admiring the sparkle in his daughter's eyes. He knew that this pendant would become a special treasure for her, not only for the object itself, but for the happy memories it represented. That same day, as the sun set on the horizon, father and daughter sat together on the lawn, watching the pink sky. Richard wrapped Emily in his arms, feeling grateful for the blessing of having her in his life. "I love you, Daddy," Emily said, hugging him tightly. "And I love you, my dear," Richard replied, feeling his heart overflow with love for his precious daughter. In those simple and precious moments, father and daughter found true happiness, an eternal connection that nothing could break. But suddenly all that was completely lost. Richard had changed. His mind became obsessed with work, and those moments grew rarer and rarer, until they became almost like breaths, lost forever. When leaving the hospital, Richard was shaken. Head down, he was walking aimlessly through the parking lot, when he found that same lady again. The beggar woman stared into Richard's eyes, her expression serious but charged with determination. "Richard, I can help you. Take your daughter home, where love and family connection can be more powerful than any medical treatment. Let me help you take care of her there, where I can look after her." Richard frowned, a mixture of surprise and disbelief painting across his face. "That's crazy," he shouted angrily. "I can't get my daughter out of the hospital. She needs the best medical care we can offer. I can't just take her home for a beggar to take care of." The beggar leaned closer to him, her words whispered in an urgent tone. "The best doctors can't do anything for her within those walls. She needs you, Richard. Take her home where she can feel your love and your presence. I'll take care of her, I promise." Richard shook his head, a mixture of anger and despair in his voice. "I'm not going to get her out of the hospital, and I shouldn't have talked to you. That's absurd." With these words, Richard turned away from the beggar, his mind spinning with confusion and uncertainty. He no longer knows who to trust or what to believe. But one thing he knew for sure: he needed to return home and be by his daughter's side, wherever it took him. With heavy steps, he headed for the car, his heart weighing with the pain of uncertainty and fear. Richard returned home with a whirlwind of thoughts cluttering his mind. He threw himself on the bed, feeling unwell, and did not let any servant disturb him. But sleep seemed elusive, as if his mind was in constant turmoil. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he finally managed to fall asleep. That night, in his dreams, he finds himself in a green field, the sun shining above and a gentle breeze caressing his face. In the middle of the field stands Elizabeth, his late wife, with a gentle smile on her lips. "Elizabeth? Is it you?" Elizabeth nods, her presence radiating calm and serenity. "Yes, my love, that's me." Richard approaches her, his heart heavy with longing and sadness. "I'm sorry about what happened to Emily. I failed as a father, and I miss you so much, Elizabeth. I don't know what to do." Elizabeth put a comforting hand on Richard's face. "You need to accept the help you're being offered, Richard. Your daughter needs you now more than ever, and the love you have for her may be the key to her salvation." Richard swallowed hard, Elizabeth's words resonating in his mind. "But what if I'm wrong? What if this is a mistake?" Elizabeth smiles, a gleam of love and trust in her eyes. "You can never go wrong when you act with love, Richard. Trust yourself and the love you have for Emily. You will find the right one." Richard looks at Elizabeth, his heart flooded with gratitude and hope. "Elizabeth, I will do what I can for our daughter." It was 5 o'clock in the morning when Richard woke up startled, his heart pounding in his chest and his face soaked with sweat, but he felt a new sense of determination burning in his chest. The dream seemed so real, so vivid, and Elizabeth's words still echoed in his mind. He got out of bed in a hurry, his mind in turmoil. He knew what he needed to do. He needed to bring his daughter home. Without touching the meal the servants had prepared, he dressed quickly and walked out the door, ordering Emily's room to be prepared. "Where are you going, sir?" "Find Emily." "What about your morning appointments?" "Cancel them all." "I was going to my car," he said, with quick, desperate steps as he made his way to the hospital, anxiety tightening more and more in his chest. Arriving at the hospital, already nervous, he searched every corner, looking for the beggar who seemed to have all the answers. He walked through the crowded corridors, looking into each face in the hope of finding the beggar's familiar face, left the hospital looking around the square, extremely confused, and found himself laughing nervously at the situation, thinking about what they would think if they saw him desperate behind a beggar. But despite his frantic search, he could not find her anywhere. Richard felt a lump form in his throat, frustration mixing with fear in his heart. He re-enters the hospital, refusing help from the nurses, and continues frantically searching every corner of the hospital, his heart heavy with anxiety and despair. He feels a lump form in his throat when he realizes that the beggar is nowhere to be found. A sense of helplessness overwhelms him, and he finds himself in the midst of a crowd, alone in his search. With trembling hands, Richard goes to the square in front of the hospital and kneels on a nearby bench, his prayers rising in desperate murmurs. He closes his eyes tightly, begging for guidance, for an answer to his anguish that seemed to consume him relentlessly. When he opens his eyes again, he hardly believes what he sees. The beggar stands before him, her presence serene and comforting. "You want to talk to me, Richard?" Richard looks at her, a mix of surprise and relief on his face. "Yes. I don't know what else to do. Please help me." The beggar smiles gently, her expression full of compassion. "It's a wise choice, Richard. I can help you." Richard rises from the bench, a new sense of determination filling his heart. Seeing in the eyes of the lady reflected determination. "Let's get her out of here and take her home. You can help her there." The beggar nods, her face expressing confidence in Richard's decision. Together they return to the hospital. Richard approaches the nurses, his voice firm but full of emotion. "I'm going to take my daughter home," he says. The nurses look at him, disbelief painted on their faces. "Mr. Davis, this is crazy. Your daughter needs the medical care that we can only provide here. Taking her home could put her in danger." Richard takes a deep breath, feeling that he has no other option, his determination unshakable. "I understand the risks, but I believe it's what's best for her. Please help us." The nurses exchange worried glances, but finally give in to Richard's determination. "All right, let's help you make preparations." Richard and the beggar woman carry Emily out of the hospital room and carefully and gently drop her off in the ambulance. And so, returning to their car, with the beggar by their side, they accompany the ambulance to the mansion, where they gently put the girl on her bed, where she looks more serene than ever. Richard watches his daughter tenderly, a mixture of relief and apprehension in his heart. "She'll be fine, Richard. I'll be here to take care of her," says the lady. The beggar's reassuring words bring some comfort to Richard's apprehensive heart. He knew he was making a risky decision, but he also felt it was what needed to be done to save his daughter. "Thank you for being here. Please take care of her as if she were your own daughter. But, tell me, I still don't know. What's your name?" The beggar woman nods, her eyes expressing determination and compassion. "My name is Mary, and I will take care of her, Richard. You can and should trust me." Richard gives Emily one last look before leaving the room, his mind filled with worry and uncertainty. He knew there was still a long way to go, but he was determined to do everything in his power to ensure his daughter's recovery. That day, throughout it, he remained awake, going in and out of the room several times, and in all of them Mary remained serene, sitting next to Emily, praying in a low voice, not wanting to eat or even drink, followed almost motionless next to the girl. Richard, on the other hand, walked from one side of the mansion to the other, praying and asking himself and his late wife if he had done the right thing. As the night wore on, Mary stood irresolute by Emily's side, her comforting presence filling the room with a sense of calm and hope. The next morning, Richard woke up with a heart heavy with anxiety, having barely slept through the night. He got out of bed running to Emily's room, his mind spinning with worry and hope. As he opened the door, he was greeted by a vision that left him breathless and made him cry. Emily was awake, her blue eyes shining with life and vitality. A mixture of shock and joy erupted on Richard's face as he ran crying to his daughter's side. "Emily, oh my God, you're awake." Emily smiled weakly, her voice weak but full of emotion. Tears flowed relentlessly down Richard's face as he hugged her tightly, feeling an overwhelming relief flood his heart. "I missed you so much, my dear. You scared us so much." The private doctors and nurses who had been hired by Richard rushed to the room, shocked by the miraculous turnaround in Emily's condition. They carried out examinations and tests, incredulous at his amazing recovery. Meanwhile, Maria watched it all silently from the corner of the room, almost invisible to the others, a soft smile playing on her lips. As the day progressed, Emily continued to improve amazingly, her strength and energy increasing every moment. And as Richard held her hand with gratitude and love, he was more than ever sure that together they could overcome any challenge life presented them with. Richard could hardly believe what he was seeing. His daughter, whom he had given up as lost, was looking at him, her eyes shining with life and vitality. And in that moment, he knew that everything had changed. Thanks to the kindness and dedication of that beggar, Emily had been brought back to him. And Richard realized that although money could buy many things, the real miracle of life was beyond any price. After Emily's miraculous improvement, Richard felt deep gratitude in his heart. He approached Maria, who at that moment was standing by the window, watching the sunlight gently pour into the room. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for us. Tell me what I owe you, and I'll do whatever it takes to repay you." Maria turned to him, a quiet smile on her face. "Richard, there is no need for a reward. All I wanted was to see your daughter healthy and happy. The love you have for her is the greatest gift you can give me, and especially her." Richard was speechless, his gratitude overflowing in his heart. He knew there were no words that could adequately express his gratitude that his daughter's life had been saved. "Thank you for everything." Maria nodded, her eyes shining with understanding. "Just remember, Richard, true value is in love and family. Cherish every moment with your daughter, as this is what really matters. And especially thank your wife, Elizabeth. It was she who sent me here." With these words, the beggar woman turned and walked out the door, leaving Richard with a renewed sense of gratitude and purpose. He knew that he had certainly witnessed a miracle. He never found her again, but the memory of her and the miracle she brought into his life remained in his heart forever. And as he embraced his daughter with love and gratitude, Richard knew that no matter what the future held for them, he would never forget the power of love and hope that brought his family back to life. Richard and Emily came to live as a family, traveled the world, and enjoyed valuable moments together. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.